Welcome to the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hey everyone, welcome to the OnScript podcast. This is Matt Lynch coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. In this episode, Matt Bates is going to be speaking with Brant Pitre about his book, Jesus and Divine Christology, which Nijay Gupta just called his book of the year. So definitely worth listening to this episode and checking out that book. Thanks to everyone who supports the podcast, either by giving or sharing the word or giving us a review on Apple Podcasts. We appreciate that. Enjoy the episode.
Hello, this is Matthew Bates for OnScript. I want to start by reading a quote from Brant Pitre's new book, Jesus and Divine Christology. But the quote itself contains a quote by the agnostic atheist scholar Bart Ehrman. Here's what Brant Pitre has to say. Though a growing number of scholars agree that Jesus spoke and acted as if he were a messianic figure, the possibility that he saw himself as divine in some sense is still often treated as a no-go area. Pitre continues, for example, Bart Ehrman emphasizes that the one thing contemporary studies of the historical Jesus all agree on is this, and now I'm quoting from Bart Ehrman, that Jesus did not spend his ministry declaring himself to be divine. One of the enduring findings of modern scholarship on the New Testament and early Christianity over the past 2 centuries is that the followers of Jesus during his life understood him to be human through and through, not God, ending the quote by Ehrman. Now, Bart Ehrman is emphatic in claiming that modern scholarship has delivered a sound and enduring verdict about 2 matters. 1, the historical Jesus didn't claim to be God. And 2, Jesus' earliest followers didn't understand him to be God either. Yet, Brant Pitre disagrees with Ehrman, and an increasing number of scholars who have written on early Christology disagree with Ehrman as well. Larry Hurtado, Richard Bauckham, the notorious Chris Tilling, who was actually going to join us for this interview but is not feeling well, and myself as well, at least disagree with the part about the earliest followers of Jesus. But Brant Pitre's book, Jesus and Divine Christology, presents evidence that contrary to the claims of Ehrman, Jesus did indeed make divine claims. And Pitre makes his case not on the grounds of the Bible says it, so I must believe it, but on purely historical grounds capable of persuading even atheist or agnostic scholars. Welcome to OnScript, Brant.
Thanks for having me, Matt. It's really good to be back with you.
Now, Brant, can we start with a big question to help frame the whole topic for listeners who are not immersed in scholarly conversations about such matters? What is the quest for the historical Jesus?
So, wow, that is a big one. I've got my handbook for the historical Jesus here on the shelf that's 4,000 pages, so I'll try to boil that down. So the quest for the historical Jesus is really the quest to look at, based on what historical reasoning and historical argumentation and historical evidence can tell us about who Jesus of Nazareth was, what he did, and what he said, and how he related in particular to the Judaism of his day, and also to the church, which emerged in the aftermath of his passion and death and his reputed resurrection. So, so really it's about getting back to what can we know about Jesus using historical evidence, historical sources, and historical methodology. And that's really what I'm trying to do in the book. It's using reason, right, to examine the historical foundations of Christianity.
And so why have some scholars and some church folk also, why have they objected to the quest for the historical Jesus? What would their concern be?
This is a great question. Well, one of the reasons I suspect is because as Albert Schweitzer showed way back at the beginning of the early 20th century in his quest for the historical Jesus, I began actually the book with a quote from Schweitzer, where Schweitzer reviews the quest from the time of Ray Morris in the 18th century all the way up to his own day. And what he argues is that if you look at the historical roots of the quest, it was always from the beginning not merely a kind of purely historical aim that was motivating it, but early questers were very explicit about the fact that they were also trying to, as Schweitzer puts it, free Christians and others from the tyranny of dogma. In other words, that the historical quest involved a theological aim of stripping Jesus of, as he puts it, the supernatural nimbus with which he had been surrounded by believers. In other words, it was very explicitly motivated by the aim to construct a merely human Jesus as opposed to the divine Christ of later Christian belief, especially as formulated at the councils of Nicaea and Chalcedon, for example. So what that did, that theological aim did, is it kind of covered the quest for the historical Jesus with a methodological tendency to either downplay or altogether ignore the question of whether on a historical level, Jesus of Nazareth himself actually might have claimed to be more than merely human, to be more than just a human Messiah, to be in some sense divine. And so that led to a situation where, as John A.T. Robinson pointed out in the 90s or the 80s, that for a long time in the scholarly quest, the question of who Jesus considered himself to be and whether he made divine self-claims came to be a kind of like no-go area. Like, it wasn't polite to ask that kind of question. It was assumed almost in many circles. Well, of course, Jesus didn't claim to be divine. That's what the whole quest for the historical Jesus was about. But what I'm trying to show in this book and what I was arguing is, well, let's hold on for a second. There are other historical figures from the Second Temple period, like Gaius Caligula, or Herod Agrippa, or Alexander the Great, or Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who made divine self-claims and which modern historians have no problem whatsoever assessing the evidence with regard to. Yet for some reason, when it comes to Jesus of Nazareth, this question of a divine self-understanding or divine self-claims is like off limits. And so for me personally, one of the things that sparked my interest in writing this was I wanted to go back to the sources and ask the question, well, wait, on the level of history, right, and on the level of historical evidence, are there actually good reasons for thinking that Jesus may have claimed to be more than merely human? Especially when, and this was really what kind of sparked the book for me, Matt, if you read New Testament scholarship like I do, I like to read widely. And although most of my research has been in historical Jesus and Jewish eschatology and that kind of thing, I also have been really fascinated by studies in early high Christology by some figures you mentioned, like Larry Hurtado and Richard Bauckham, Chris Tilling, and yourself. And one of the things I was noticing was that there was kind of a paradox. In historical Jesus research, there's for a long time been an almost unanimous consensus that Jesus of Nazareth never claimed to be divine. Yet when you come over into early high Christology studies, which often focus on Paul and the writings of the early church, you'll find an emerging consensus that, well, actually the first Jewish believers going all the way back to the beginning had a divine Christology, had an early high Christology, and that Christology was, contrary to what some people assume, it didn't begin with a merely human low Christology and then gradually develop into a high divine Christology, but was in fact divine from the beginning. And I thought, wow, this is a fascinating paradox. On the one hand, you got historical Jesus scholars saying, well, of course he never claimed to be anything more than human. On the other hand, the early high Christologists are saying, well, actually, early Christian belief, including Jewish belief, was Christological belief is divine from the beginning. And so the question I'm asking, which is a historical question, is how do you get from A, right, the merely human Jesus of his lifetime, to Z, right? You get this early high Christology. And there were lots of answers that people have given, like it was the resurrection that led to the divinization of Christ, or revelatory experiences in the early church led to offering the risen Christ the kind of worship that would be given to a God. But in this book, what I'm exploring is it at least possible that the reason early Christology was divine from the beginning, in the wake of Jesus' life, was because Jesus had made divine self-claims before his death and during his lifetime. And that's really what the book is about. And what I'm arguing is that if you look at the Gospels, especially if you look at them in the light of Second Temple Jewish messianism, Jesus of Nazareth did in fact claim to be divine, but he did it in a Jewish way, using parables, allusions to Jewish scripture, and actions and riddles that implied, for those who had the eyes to see and the ears to hear, his identity with and equality with the one God of Israel, and the fact that he's more than merely human. So that's really what the book is about. It's trying to look at Jesus' divine self-claims, but in a Jewish context.
Yeah, thank you. And you've already spoken a little bit about, kind of what motivated the writing of this book and, kind of touched on your thesis. How if you were to put your thesis in kind of the crispest way that you can do on the spot, what's your exact thesis in the book then, Brant?
It's kind of twofold. It's number one, that the reason the earliest Christology was divine Christology is because Jesus of Nazareth made divine claims before he was executed by the Romans. And then second, it's that if you want to be able to see this, you have to understand that Jesus claimed to be divine, but he did it in a Jewish way. So that it's easy to miss the divine self-claims if you are not putting the words and actions of Jesus described in the Gospels in their Second Temple Jewish context, and you're not paying close attention to the Old Testament texts like the Shema or the Decalogue or the book of Isaiah or the book of Daniel, to which he is alluding, and looking at how those texts were interpreted by other Second Temple Jews with reference to, for example, as John Collins and others have shown, the idea of a divine messianism, a divine Messiah, which Second Temple Jewish scholars and early Jewish scholars of early Judaism agree is something that is widespread. It's in the air in the first century AD. So anyway, those are the two main theses. There might be a third one, actually. The third one is this, because this one's important. Contrary to the widespread assumption that Jesus only speaks and acts as if he's divine in the Gospel of John, all right, and that in the Synoptics he's merely human, I try to show that actually, if you look at the text carefully, the score is not 3 merely human Jesuses, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, against 1 divine Jesus in John, but it's actually 4 against 0. Like in all 4 first century biographies, Jesus speaks and acts as if he's more than merely human. So the score is 4-0. You got 4 biographies of Jesus from within the living memory of the events that they recount, in which he is making divine claims and acting in ways that point to his more than merely human status. So those are kind of the basic 3 theses. I know it's not just one, but that's really what the book's about.
Yeah, thanks, Brant. And I just can't hold back in wanting to speak some words of praise for this book, because I think this is the book that we've been waiting for in the field. I think this is the book that whenever I read it actually before it was released. As I'm on the back cover for this one, but my response was finally when I read this book that this is I think the book that will move the field forward, because you're working with some categories that some other people have worked with, but you're doing it in a very innovative way. And I think that your argument that Jesus is using a messianic Christology that is a divine Christology, but doing it in a very distinctively Jewish way through riddling is really the innovation that it really drives your argument. And then, of course, the comparative work methodologically is just very sound. So congratulations on this book, Brant. I really think this book is a book that will move the field. So I just wanted to say that and make sure listeners here. I don't do that.
No, I appreciate that. I really do, because I mentioned the handbook for the historical Jesus that I have, that 4,000-page compilation of essays. It was published in like 2011. And one of the striking things about it is it's 4,000 pages long, and there's not a single essay in it on whether Jesus of Nazareth made divine claims, which anyone who knows anything about Christianity knows this is one of the foundational claims of Christianity, is that Jesus is not merely human, but also divine. And yet we're not even entertaining the possibility that he may have made some kind of claims during his lifetime. So I felt like this was a real gaping lacuna in historical Jesus research in particular. And what I began to discover, Matt, as I worked through the hundreds of Jesus books on my shelf, is that every now and then in these books on historical Jesus by figures like Gerhard Ludemann and others who are not inclined to support Christianity in terms of like the positive truth claims being made by the Christian faith, will admit, well, yeah, like in this passage in the Synoptics, Jesus is obviously a divine being. In this passage, when he walks on the sea, he looks like he's Zeus or one of the gods who's demonstrating divine power over the elements. And I began to notice, well, wait up. I've got quotes, and there are lots in the book, from Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, atheists, non-religious scholars alike, all admitting, well, yeah, in this passage, Jesus is speaking and acting as if he's divine. But it seems like none of that was impacting the field of historical Jesus research. It wasn't making its way over into the field in which I spend most of my time. So I wanted to gather all those things together and show that this isn't just me saying it. This is actually scholars across the religious spectrum And over the last 100 years, recognizing the divine actions and the divine words of Jesus, not just in the Gospel of John, but predominantly actually in the Synoptics. Most of the material I cover in the book is from the Synoptics.
Yeah, and I think that was part of the power of the book too, is that often these claims are made. Well, of course, John has this, these ideas that Jesus is divine, but some among more skeptical scholars like, well, who could trust John on that, right? He's late. But I think that the part of the power of your book is that 10 out of the 12 episodes that you spend a lot of time on are drawn from the Synoptics primarily, and of course you correlate with John, but the driving energy is an analysis of the Synoptics in the book. Let me do a little bit more to introduce you. Dr. Brant Pitre, PhD, University of Notre Dame, is the Distinguished Research Professor of Scripture at the Augustine Institute in St. Louis. Apart from the book we're presently discussing, Jesus and Divine Christology, Brant's the author of numerous titles, including Jesus and the Last Supper, published by Erdman's, as well as Jesus and the Jewish Roots of Mary by Image, Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Eucharist, Doubleday, and The Case for Jesus, also Image. He also co-authored, along with Michael Barber and John Kincaid, Paul, a New Covenant Jew, which was by Erdman's, and which we interviewed Brant and Michael around. And I think John was also interviewed by Chris as part of that. It's a really fine book. So you can go back and look at our backlist for On Script if you want to hear another interview with Brant on Paul, a very different interview and topic. So Brant, are you ready for a more personal question then?
Oh, okay, sure.
Well, not deeply personal, but it depends on how you take it. It's that you dedicated the book to John Meyer, somebody I know as well and have a fondness in memory of. And I was just wanting to hear more. You speak about it a little bit in the acknowledgments, but I wanted to hear a little bit more about John's impact on your scholarship and why you dedicated the book to John Meyer.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the reason I dedicated it to John Meyer was because he's the reason I got into the field of historical Jesus research. When I was an undergraduate, my wife had got me for Christmas. She bought me the first 2 volumes of A Marginal Jew back in the early 90s. I think it was like 95. So that was the first year of our
You were a better undergraduate student than I was. I was still reading comic books at that stage, I think, Brant.
Yeah, that's a very kind way of saying I was a nerd. Thank you, Matt. Yeah, so Meyer was my entry into the field, and I was immediately impressed by his clarity of thought and expression, his exhaustive research, and just the compelling way he argued methodically for his positions. And by the time I was finished with volume 2, I was, again, I think I was a junior at this point. I knew this is what I want to do. I want to be a biblical scholar, and not just biblical scholar. I really want to go into this field of historical Jesus research. So when I went to Vanderbilt for my master's degree, Amy Jo Levine was there, wonderful New Testament scholar, Jewish New Testament scholar who was my mentor. She said, well, if you like Meyer so much, why don't you apply to Notre Dame? Because he had just gotten hired there. So I actually ended up at the University of Notre Dame precisely because Meyer was there. And I was just always inspired by his brilliance and his ability to not just look at the secondary literature, but the primary sources. I had hoped, as we all probably did if you're in the field, that he would eventually finish Marginal Jew, but as you know, he passed away not unexpectedly. He had been ill for a while, but an untimely death for sure, and was not able to finish his magnum opus. So that was very sad to me. I'd really hoped and looked forward to what he was going to do in the final volume, because he was supposed to actually address in that final volume the enigma of Jesus' self-understanding. So he was going to get to this topic. So I felt that this was something that I could honor him by dedicating this book to him, because although I have no doubts he would have disagreed with this or that conclusion, he was a very, very, very staunch critic. If you were a graduate student, you turned a paper into Meyer, you got it back with fear and trembling. But he was also such a gentleman, and I hope he would have been proud of the work that I did. So that's really why I dedicated the book to. I would not be a professor, and I certainly wouldn't be in historical Jesus research if it hadn't been for Meyer's work.
Well, I think he would be very proud of you, but he might have wanted to fight with you about method.
Oh, there's no doubt about that.
But he would be wrong. He would be wrong if he fought with you. I did one of my candidacy exam questions under Meyer on method and the historical Jesus, and I thought his method was wrong, and so my whole candidacy exam was like, well, how am I going to tell Meyer he's wrong? Because I really disagreed with his method. It was.
I wouldn't want to be in your shoes.
I got a lot of red back on that. I mean, he obviously passed my candidacy, but I was a little bit nervous about how that would go. We'll talk about method when we get to that part. I'm getting to that still.
One thing you can't say about Meyer is that he doesn't follow his method, though.
That's true. That's true.
Maybe even to a fault, right? I mean, he was faithful to it. Yeah.
Your comment that his work was exhaustive is the absolute truth. Both in the primary and the secondary literature, he was really phenomenally well read.
His erudition is unmatched. I mean, the only person I put in his category is Dale Allison. Those two are just the most brilliant and erudite scholars. It really is
certainly
impressive.
Certainly giants in the field. So let's talk a little bit about chapter 1, where you begin to get into your project, and you, on the one hand, are wanting to talk about early high Christology and affirm that yes, there has been a movement in the field toward an early high Christology, and you think this offers 4 preliminary warrants for your project, that Jesus put himself forward as, in some sense, divine. Which of those 4 warrants do you find most compelling that you would want to speak to in terms of sharing with our listeners?
Yeah, I think for me personally, it was the realization. So I list 4. Number 1, that if you look at Second Temple Jewish scholarship, or scholarship on Second Temple Judaism, there's a widespread acknowledgement of the idea of a divinity of Messiah as part of the Jewish landscape at the time of Jesus. The second one is there's also a growing acknowledgement by a wide range of scholars that Jesus made messianic self-claims. That was something that back in the 70s and 80s, I think, would have been very skeptically approached, that we don't even know that Jesus made a messianic claim. But there's a growing recognition that actually the evidence, E.P. Sanders talks about this, Jesus presents himself as king of the kingdom of God, and we all know who the king is in Jewish messianic expectations, the Messiah. I would say, though, for me personally, out of these 4 historical warrants, it was really the dawning realization that Jesus not only speaks and acts as if he's divine in John, but in all 4 Gospels. That was the most compelling, especially on the question of the blasphemy charges. All right. So this will be the final chapter in the book, but I did begin with it because I thought it was compelling. If you begin to look at all 4 of the Gospels, whether it's Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 5, John 10 and 9, all 4 first century Gospels, Jesus is accused of blasphemy in the context of questions about his identity. That's the qualifier. So whether it's the healing of the paralytic, right? Who is this who forgives sins? This is something only God can do. Or whether it's in the context of the trial before the Sanhedrin, right? We've all heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict? He deserves death. If you look at any one of these passages, what you'll see is on more than one occasion, both at the beginning and at the end of his public ministry, Jesus is being accused of blasphemy in the context of questions about his identity. And if you know anything about Second Temple Judaism, you'll note that that's significant because in a first century Jewish context, I can't stress this enough, especially having taught students for many years who think, oh, well, he was accused of blasphemy because he claimed to be the Messiah. I can't stress enough that in a first century Jewish context, it was not blasphemy to claim to be the Messiah. This is really crucial. The Messiah is just the anointed heir to the Davidic throne, right? If it were blasphemy to claim to be the royal heir to the throne, how would you even know who he was when he appeared, right? It was not blasphemy to claim to be the Messiah in a first century Jewish context, but it was blasphemy to claim to be more than merely human, to claim to be divine, to claim to be a heavenly being, to speak or act as if you were co-equal with the one God. Those were blasphemous claims. And so the fact that in all 4 of our first century biographies of Jesus, he's accused of blasphemy in the context of a question about his identity really pushed me to ask, well, if that's the case, why is Jesus being accused of blasphemy unless he too is making divine self-claims, right? The clearest parallel with this from the secondary or Second Temple period would be Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, in the book of Maccabees, right? It literally says in chapter 9 that he was a blasphemer because he claimed isotheia, equality with God, right? And of course, he minted coins that said Antiochus Epiphanu, right? Like he's the epiphany of God. And this is one of the reasons he's one of the most reviled figures in Judaism in the Second Temple period. And so the idea that a historical figure can make divine self-claims, that's something that historians recognize. But for whatever reason, when it comes to Jesus of Nazareth, there's a tendency to just pass by those blasphemy claims and not really deal with the implications of what they might mean for his self-understanding and the claims he made about his identity.
Let's talk method for a minute and kind of change gears a little bit. And in talking about method, I think it's certainly true that the quest for the historical Jesus has borne, let's call it, strange fruit. There's been some odd conclusions in the quest for the historical Jesus. You don't have to go farther than maybe Funk, Crossan, the Jesus Seminar, to see some of the strangeness. And if we've had strange fruit, maybe it's because our methods have not been fully adequate. And so in terms of your method, you and Michael Barber, who we just recently interviewed with his book on Matthew and the Temple, you use E.P. Sanders' triple context approach. And just for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and read from your page 27, where you kind of sketch that quite precisely. And here you say, in Sanders' description of his method of proceeding, there are three implicit arguments for historicity, which I would define as follows. Number one, contextual plausibility within first century Judaism. Number two, coherence with other evidence about Jesus. And number three, consequences in the early church. This is the sort of triple context method then involves correlating those 3 points. Is there anything you want to elaborate on in terms of what would you like to emphasize in explaining this method a little bit more fully for our listeners?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the main thing I would emphasize is that the reason I adopted Sanders' approach with some modifications is because I felt like his book, Jesus and Judaism, has really stood the test of time precisely where it tends to follow this method. Namely that if we're going to draw conclusions about what Jesus of Nazareth did or said, then what we need to do is paint a picture that makes sense in these three contexts. Okay, that's what he means a triple context. In other words, if a saying or deed of Jesus is contextually plausible within his first century Jewish context, if it coheres with other data, other evidence that we have about him, and if it explains and kind of presents a point of origin for effects that we see present in the early church, then it's reasonable to conclude that that saying or action goes back to Jesus himself. The reason I find that compelling is I think this is how all historical research works. Most people will look at historical figures, whether it's Antiochus IV or Alexander the Great or whoever it may be, and ask, well, does the data about them fit into the context in which they lived? Does it cohere with other accounts of their life, of their sayings or actions? And especially if they're the founder of a movement like Jesus was, do we see the effects of that life play out in a plausible way in the aftermath of their life? And if those three things are true, then it's reasonable to conclude that this or that datum goes back to Jesus. The other reason I like this method is, unlike other approaches, like some of the traditional form critical criteria that have been subject to a lot of criticism, this one works in the reverse too. In other words, if a datum is contextually implausible, if it doesn't fit into a first century Jewish context, if it is incoherent, if it doesn't cohere with other data about Jesus, and if we don't see any real aftermath or effects, plausible effects in the early church, then yeah, it would be reasonable to conclude that that saying or action is in fact unhistorical or doesn't go back to Jesus or any other historical figure for that matter that we might be dealing with. So what I liked about this methodological approach to triple context approach is that it's reversible. It works in the direction of both historical plausibility and historical implausibility, and that it's not idiosyncratic to New Testament studies. You could apply this method to Jesus, John the Baptist, Caiaphas, any other historical figure from the Second Temple period or beyond. And to me, that's a gain. And I've found the more I've used this method in my research, the more it seems a reasonable and sound method. It doesn't pass the muster of mathematical proof. That's not what we're talking about here. But in terms of degrees of probability and historical reasoning, I think that this is, for me personally, a very helpful way to approach it. And as I show in the book, this is what everyone's doing anyway. If you look at multiple scholars, I give quotes, when it comes down to actual judgments about the historicity of a particular saying or particular action, it's these three criteria that are actually motivating and animating final judgments about historicity, whether people have formulated these into a coherent methodology or not. So I'm trying to bring out what I think other scholars are already doing when they draw historical verdicts about a saying or an action that's attributed to Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah, I think one of the great strengths of this project is that very sound method. And I think you're probably too charitable to the field when you say that other scholars have been doing this. Some have, some haven't. I'd say maybe whenever they're doing things well, they've been doing this. But one of the big obstacles, I think, in historical Jesus studies has been that criterion of dissimilarity that has ended up making Jesus weird. You end up with Jesus as a wandering philosopher cynic, because of the denial of your third point there, which is consequences in the early church. If you start saying we're not going to take into account consequences into the early church, we're not going to take into account the possible effects of the historical Jesus because we're worried about being tainted by later dogma, you end up with a very weird Jesus. But that's not valid history. That's not how we do history. You have to look at the effect. And I think that's one of the great strengths of your approach is bringing that back in, to say, what kind of effect did any historical figure cause? We have to take that into account.
It's absolutely crucial. This was Joseph Klausner, the great early 20th century Jewish scholars, dictum, ex nihilo nihil fit, right? Nothing comes from nothing. Where there's smoke, there's fire. We really do have to ask in any given example whether the smoke of the early church and its divine Christology goes back to the fire of a divine messianism in the life of Jesus or not. That is a really crucial criterion. And I do think you're right that a lot of 20th century scholarship, by turning it on its head and saying, if there's a discernible effect, then we know it didn't happen. I mean, that's just it's irrational. It doesn't make a lot of sense at all from a historical point of view.
Yeah, and it's not how we do history in any other field.
In any other
right?
field.
Yes,
that was what always bothered me. It was the idiosyncratic nature of so much 20th century historical Jesus research. When I read other historiography, I'm like, this isn't how they approach things. There's something's off here. And I felt like Sanders represented a more classical historical approach to the data, although he himself falls into a Boltzmannian dissimilarity. He'll use dissimilarity when, I don't want to say when it serves his purposes. I don't want to make it sound nefarious, but he does. He isn't consistent about it. Yeah, is my opinion.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk about chapter 2, Epiphanic miracles, in just a second. Yeah. But let's do a speed round, just to change of pace here. So who would you rather have over for dinner at your house? C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, or G.K. Chesterton?
Oh, hands down, Tolkien. No contest. No contest.
Okay. And is that a Catholic bias? It's not, because
come now.
You could have chosen Chesterton too.
I could have chosen Chesterton, but I've loved Tolkien. The other reason I'm a professor is because when I was in high school, I read Humphrey Carpenter's biography of Tolkien. Again, I was a nerd, and realized, Tolkien was a professor. That's what I'm going to have to be then, because The Lord of the Rings is by far my favorite phenomenal work of fiction. I just finished reading it to my 14-year-old, and it never ceases to amaze. I'm actually reading Holly Ordway's spiritual biography of Tolkien called Tolkien's Faith right now. It just came out. Fantastic. It would definitely be Tolkien. I'd have so many questions for him, and he seemed like a cool guy too.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, question number 2. I'm going to make a statement. You have to rate your agreement with it on a scale of 0 to 10.
Okay.
All right. So, American cheese is neither American nor cheese.
5. I don't know. I really, my jury's out. I haven't ever thought about this question. So, no strong feelings. Maybe we'll take it down to 0. I have no strong feelings about that in any way.
Brant, why did the dinosaurs go extinct?
Oh, well, come on, Matt. It was aliens, of course.
Oh, all right.
That's always the answer, right?
It's either the aliens or the asteroids.
It's the aliens or the asteroids. And maybe the aliens sent the asteroid. Think about it.
All right, so here's a question, to tap into your Catholicity here. Do you think Pope Francis will follow Benedict's lead and retire from the papacy and become an emeritus pope or not? If you're gonna wager, you gotta put money on it. What are you gonna?
If I put money on it, I'd say no. He had intimated that at the beginning of his pontificate, but he's shown no signs. I think he seems less and less inclined to do that lately. He seems to be have settled into the position and enjoying himself. So I don't think he will. I could be wrong.
Yeah. Well, Benedict was clearly trying to set a precedent, so it'll be interesting to see what happens.
I do think. And Francis, if you read his writings, he has an immense respect for Benedict, contrary to what sometimes people will portray. So if he does it, I think he will do it out of deference to the precedent that he thinks Benedict set, because there is a precedent in Catholic episcopacy for retiring bishops, retiring cardinals. The pontificate, the Bishop of Rome, is a little unique in that regard. So I can see him thinking pastorally that might be something worth doing. I just don't see him. He doesn't show signs of it lately.
So do you have, and you can't choose Benedict, a favorite contemporary theologian?
Oh, a favorite contemporary theologian. If I had to pick, it's a friend of mine. It's Matthew Levering.
Oh, gosh.
Matthew is so erudite, so brilliant, and also he's so humble. If you've ever seen him speak.
He's a neat guy. I've met him a couple times, and
I admire, as much as I admire scholarship, which I've always learned so much from him, I admire his humility and his, he always puts others ahead of him. It's just a beautiful, he's just a beautiful.
I've only met him a couple of times, but that's interesting because that's one of the things that immediately struck me about him when I met him, and that's not true about a lot of people. Yeah.
And he's assiduous in his reading. If he's written on a book on a topic, go get it, because you will learn. He'll orient you to the field, he'll put you in dialogue with everyone, and he's brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
All right, so let's go back to the main task at hand. In chapter 2 is Epiphanic miracles. What is an Epiphanic miracle, first of all, and I'll ask you to talk about one or two.
Okay, yeah. So this is one of my favorite chapters. I got the language of Epiphanic miracle from John Meyer and a few other scholars who will talk about the fact that if you look at certain miracles of Jesus, you can categorize them, right? There are healing miracles, there are deliverance miracles. Obviously, you have exorcisms, which we don't always put in the miraculous category, but there's certainly more than merely natural powers being manifested. But there's this other category of miracles in which the point of the miracle is to unveil or to reveal the superhuman or heavenly character of the person performing the miracle. And so they make visible, as Meyer put it, the invisible mystery of Jesus' identity. And so I really wanted to focus on these miracles before we got into the sayings of Jesus and that kind of thing in chapter 2, precisely because I thought it was important to clear the ground of that, frankly, what I believe to be a myth, the myth of the merely human Jesus and the synoptics. Because I think that myth, which has animated historical Jesus scholarship for so long, can really only be sustained if you ignore the epiphanic miracles, if you ignore the epiphany miracles, like the stilling of the storm, or the walking on water, or the transfiguration on the mountain. Those are the three that I look at, which scholars across the spectrum will refer to as epiphany miracles, but we don't necessarily always draw out the implications of that. Well, if these are epiphanic miracles, and again, these are all in the synoptic gospels, then what exactly is being revealed? What is that invisible identity, as Meyer puts it, which is being made visible through these particular miracles? So what I did in this chapter was just say, look, across the board, whatever religious persuasion might be, scholars of the historical Jesus agree that Jesus of Nazareth was regarded as a miracle worker in his lifetime. I mean, Bart Ehrman's really forthright about this. So on the one hand, everyone agrees Jesus was a miracle worker. On the other hand, what we tend to do is basically ignore those miracles that appear to reveal that he's more than merely human. And so what I was trying to do in this chapter was just say, let's bracket the philosophical question of whether miracles are possible just for a minute, just to ask the question, on the level of narrative, does Jesus speak and act as if he's more than merely human in the synoptic gospels when we look carefully at these epiphany miracles? And the conclusion that I came to is that absolutely he does, especially when you look at each one of them in the light of Jewish scripture. and in light of Second Temple Jewish beliefs about the power of God over the wind and waves and the elements, and what Jesus is doing and saying in each of these miracles. So that was really the goal here, is that to show that apart from the question of the philosophical possibility of miracles, it's absolutely indisputable that Jesus is speaking and acting in these epiphany miracles in a way that shows he's more than human. Just as, again, Antiochus IV, the reason he's called Epiphanes is because he believed himself to be more than human. He believed himself to be divine. And I think the same thing's being revealed in each one of these.
And I think one of the great strengths of your book here is that you don't just stick to Scripture and saying, okay, well, Jesus is doing things that, echo what we see in the Old Testament that God alone can do, but you say, like, there's actually precedents within Second Temple Judaism or the Greco-Roman literature that show that that the idea of, for instance, walking on the water is more than that you're making a divine claim, and that other people did it, not just Jesus, right? That so you give an example where you show that Second Maccabees refers to Antiochus as showing that he had arrogance, that he could walk on the land and on the sea, right? Because his mind was elated in these sort of heightened ways. Yeah, but the one I really love,
human arrogance is what it's called. Yeah.
The one I really loved was your example where you talk about Caligula.
Oh yes, this is fantastic.
This is something that was reported both. So this is by outside sources. So Josephus and Suetonius.
And Suetonius, yes.
Yeah, both report this. But I'm going to go ahead and read, just for the sake of listeners, a little bit from Josephus's Jewish Antiquities, chapter 19, section 4. So this is talking about then Caligula. His other actions did not fall short of madness. For instance, it was insufferable, he thought, to cross the bay from the city at that's going to be hard to say, Dicarchia in Campania to Misenum, another maritime city in a trireme. Then, too, he considered it his privilege as Lord of the sea to require the same service from the sea as he received from the land. So the 30 furlongs of sea from headland to headland were connected by pontoons, which cut off the whole bay, and over this bridge he drove in his chariot. And this is the part that really kills me, and that is really strong for your thesis. He said, that Josephus reports this about Caligula. That way of traveling, said he, befitted his godhead.
Absolutely.
That he didn't find it fitting that he would have to walk across land to get from point to point, but that he should show his dominance over the sea as this befitted his godhead, right? To have these pontoons constructed so he could drive across them in his chariot, which would be more fitting for a god
than for a man. That's exactly right.
Amazing.
It is amazing. Yeah. This man, when I kind of stumbled onto that parallel in Josephus and Suetonius, it was amazing, because what I was trying to do in the early chapters is look, okay, are there other Second Temple historical figures who made divine claims during their lifetime? And Caligula, Gaius Caligula, who's first century Roman emperor, is easily the most famous because everyone thought he was crazy, precisely because he didn't wait till after his death to be divinized like some of the earlier emperors. He wanted to be treated as if he was divine during his lifetime. That's why many of them called him crazy. They called him mad. And his madness was on full display precisely when he performs this public event of crossing the sea on these pontoons to show that he's not just a merely mortal emperor, he's the Lord of the sea. Because it befitted his godhead to walk on the waves. Well, that story is indicative of how power over the wind or power over the waves in both a Jewish and a Greco-Roman context was seen as something that was superhuman and fitting of a divine being. So when Jesus of Nazareth, therefore, in the Synoptics, and of course in John chapter 6 as well, so you got Mark 6, Matthew 14, and John 6, comes to his disciples walking on the waves of the Sea of Galilee, and doesn't just walk on the waves, but says to them, don't be afraid, ego eimi, right? Me phobesta, don't be afraid, I am. Those three things together, the admonition not to be afraid, which you often will see in theophanies, right? The walking on the sea, which even in a Greco-Roman context bespeaks divinity. And then, of course, the famous ego eimi, I am, taken together, it is, I think it's indisputable that this is an epiphanic miracle, that Jesus isn't just saying, look what I can do, but he's actually revealing his superhuman identity. He's revealing his Godhead, as Caligula is trying to do, although he's having to use technology of making this bridge of pontoons in order to make it appear as if he's walking on the sea. Whereas in the Gospels, of course, Jesus is doing what Caligula only wished he could do. And I did point this out. This is something I want to highlight, is that if you look at the Gospel accounts, both in Mark and in John, it's really clear too that although sometimes we might imagine the walking on the sea as like, the disciples maybe 45, 100 yards from the shore and Jesus comes across a sandbar or something, as some scholars actually proposed. Actually, according to the Gospel accounts, they're in the midst of the sea, which the Sea of Galilee at its widest point is about 7 miles wide, okay? So as I like to joke with my students, look, if Jesus didn't know he was divine by mile 1, he probably figured it out by mile 4, like this is a truly tremendous account that's being described here in the Synoptic Gospels. And of course, you see the disciples' reaction to this, right? Or to something in the storm, right? Who then is this that even the wind and seas obey him? They too, when they're confronted with these epiphanic miracles, it's not a coincidence. It's not insignificant that they immediately go to the identity question. Who is this man? Because they recognize the implications of both the words and the actions. Can I make a real quick note about the walk in the sea too?
Sure.
I'm sure people may be thinking, wait, doesn't ego in me just mean it's me, right? Or, I am he. Isn't that the implication? And that's absolutely the case. Like if you look at certain contexts, ego in me without the predicate can simply be a way of identifying oneself. The blind man does it in the Gospel of John. He says, I am, but I say that it's him. And I'm not denying that Jesus is saying that he's identifying himself, because remember, the Gospels tell us that the disciples think he's a ghost, and, there's a question of identity. But that's not all he's doing, because if you take the divine epithet of I am and you pronounce it while you're walking on the water, right? Context matters here, right? And if you go back to the Old Testament, of course, many scholars will recognize that there's an allusion to Exodus 3:14 and the divine I am and the theophany to Moses. But this isn't a theophany as much as it's a Christophany, if you want to be specific about it, in this epiphanic miracle. So in each one of these episodes, stilling the storm, walking the sea, transfiguration, what you have is the human Jesus unveiling, lifting the veil, so to speak, and revealing his superhuman and divine status in ways that would have been understood not only by Jewish readers of the Gospels, but also by Greco-Roman audience.
Thank you. Now, in chapter 3, Brant, you get into maybe the more distinctively, where I saw you, you're making your own contribution all the way through, but this was really at the heart of your kind of distinctive portions of your thesis, is that Jesus is putting forward himself as a divine Messiah, but doing so in a riddling fashion, which is a Jewish way, a Jewish mode of discourse. Maybe could you explain why it's distinctively Jewish, and maybe give us an example of one of your favorite passages from your 3rd chapter on Jesus as the divine riddler, and why that matters for a study of his divinity?
Great question. Okay, so if you look at the field of historical Jesus research, everyone admits that Jesus taught in parables, that Jesus of Nazareth taught in parables. This is one of the distinctive characteristic features of the historical Jesus. But what tends to get overlooked is that the word parable, in Hebrew, mashal, doesn't just refer to the kind of narrative parables that we're so familiar with, like the Good Samaritan or the lost sheep or prodigal son, whatever it might be, but that a mashal can also be used to describe a riddle, a short saying, a pithy saying that's actually meant to puzzle the reader and puzzle the listener into pondering some truth which is not immediately, evident, right? It's meant to make you question. And so what I argue in this is that there are a few riddles in the synoptics where Jesus is using the mashal form precisely to invite the audience into asking the question of his identity. And so for me, I think they're all so important. It's hard to pick one.
Yeah, you had 6 of them that you covered there.
Yeah. Well, let me just hit at least, there are 2 that I really want to hit. So the first one is, whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy to be my disciple. Or in the Lucan version, if you don't hate your mother and father, you can't be my disciple. That is such a shocking saying. Why would Jesus demand super parental love? Like, who is he claiming to be? Well, what I discovered is if you go back and you look at Second Temple Jewish sources, Philo and Josephus, in their commentaries on the Decalogue, right, the first of which regarding your neighbor is honor your father and mother, actually say that in a Jewish context, your father and mother are second only to God. They actually say that they stand between the bridge between, they stand right in the middle between divinity and humanity. That's where parents are in a Jewish context. So for Jesus to say, you have to love me, rabbi, right, more than your father and mother, is to demand a super parental love, which in a Jewish context could only be given, according to Josephus and Philo, to God alone. So I think that otherwise shocking saying actually is an invitation to recognize that Jesus is putting himself on par, not just with any divine being, note, but with the God of the Decalogue, okay? The God of the Shema, right? You're supposed to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. But here Jesus is saying, yeah, you need to love me above your parents. And so Jacob Neusner actually, in one of his little books on Jesus, contemporary rabbi, passed away not long ago, he says, listen, when it comes to this passage, only God can ask of me what Jesus is demanding, this super parental love. But I do think it's the form of a riddle. This is one of the really important points about why the quest for the historical Jesus so often misses the divine claims, is because, especially as moderns, we're looking for Jesus to come out and just say explicitly, unequivocally, hey, everybody, I'm God, right? Chris Tilling in his blurb, he wasn't able to be here today, but I loved it. In his blurb, he talked about Jesus going around the shores of Galilee saying, hey, Capernaumites, I'm God. Don't look at me like that. I'm begotten, not made, don't you know? Like, he was kind of mocking the idea that we kind of want any divine claims to be explicit, or otherwise they're not divine. But that's just to ignore what kind of teacher Jesus was. He's a Jewish teacher of parables. So the riddles are designed specifically to draw out from the audience the question, who is this man claiming to be? The other one that for me was the most important, and I do think it's crucial, is the riddle of David's Lord in Mark 12. The famous riddle where Jesus says, why do the scribes say that the Messiah is the son of David, when in the Psalms, David calls him Lord. He quotes Psalm 110, the Lord said to my Lord, you've done a lot of work on this, I know you know this one. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. And Jesus asked the question, if the Messiah is David's son, how can he call him Lord, right? And it said, and the crowds loved it. They delighted in the way, in what he said, because they recognize this is a riddle. It's a puzzle. It's a question. And what's so interesting about this, Matt, is that this is the only time in the Synoptics where Jesus explicitly mentions ho Christos in one of his sayings and one of his teachings, right? So if we want to look for Jesus's Christology, so to speak, right, this is the passage to go to. And yet it is routinely ignored in studies of the historical Jesus. It's really bizarre. And I think it actually goes back to your discontinuity point earlier. Because this passage is so widely used in the early church, Bultmann and those of his followers said, well, then it can't be historical, precisely because it is continuous with some of the developments we see in the early church. But what I tried to show here is that in this parable, in this riddle, contrary to what some people assume, Jesus is not denying that the Messiah is Davidic or that he's the son of David. He never says the Messiah is not the son of David. He's asking a question about how can David refer to this king in the Psalms as Lord if the Messiah is the son of David? So is he superior or inferior? That's the riddle. And of course, what he's trying to lead his audience to see is that the Messiah is Davidic. He's not denying that, but he's more than David. He's greater than David. I use the phrase, he's a super Davidic Messiah. And by going to Psalm 110, in which the king that's being described doesn't just sit on the earthly throne of Solomon, but sits on the heavenly throne beside God in heaven, then the implication of that allusion to Scripture in the context of the riddle is He's not just super Davidic, he's a super Davidic Messiah who's co-equal with God. Because if you're going to sit on the divine throne, that implies divinity. It implies co-equality with the Lord. And that is the real upshot of the allusion to Psalm 110. So for me personally, this is just Mark 12 is a perfect example of how Jesus doesn't make explicit, unequivocal divine claims. He's going to make implicit, elusive divine claims because he's a Jewish teacher speaking to a Jewish audience. He's using parables, he's using riddles, not just to unlock the mystery of the kingdom of God. He'll do that with his parables, the mystery of the kingdom. But in some cases, it's to unveil the mystery of his identity, to lead people, to invite people into seeing that he's more than ordinary. He's more than an ordinary human being. He is a heavenly Messiah, a super Davidic Messiah, even a divine Messiah. That's what I think he's doing there.
I think one of the great strengths of your approach in that chapter is, as you yourself point out in your conclusions, is the way in which it explains the road to Nicaea. And the length of the road to Nicaea makes more sense whenever we see Jesus as a riddler, right? Whenever he's putting forward puzzles about his identity because precisely he is a Jewish teacher, then it's not surprising if it takes the church a while to hammer out the exact philosophical language to discuss the relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, or how Jesus can be human and divine at the same time. You know, the road to Nicaea and Chalcedon becomes more explicable with Jesus as somebody who characteristically told riddles about his identity. So I really loved that chapter. Well, the whole book is phenomenal, but that chapter I thought was really a strong chapter.
Well, I appreciate that because, again, as moderns, we want kind of unequivocal, univocal statements, even philosophical. You're looking for the wrong thing if you're going to the Gospels and expecting that. But just because you don't find that doesn't mean you don't find divine claims.
Now, in your fourth chapter, Brant, you talk about the category of apocalyptic, which is a well-worn territory within the New Testament field, but you did something surprising with it that I didn't anticipate, that I thought was very insightful. And you talk about how a lot of the historical Jesus research has embraced Jesus as an apocalyptic prophet, rightly so, right? But it's mainly been about timing, like that it's been focused on like end of times kind of things connected to apocalyptic. But you point out that the standard definitions of apocalyptic and all of our apocalyptic literature also has a spatial or a heavenly dimension that involves unveiling heavenly mysteries, so that apocalyptic is not just about the end of time or something along those lines. It's about unveiling heavenly mysteries. Speak about that a little bit more and why that would be. What's an example that you find a pertinent example that shows why this is important for assessing the historical Jesus?
Yeah, I would never have known that if I didn't go to Notre Dame, where we had such a heavy emphasis on the Second Temple period. But it's absolutely the case. Everyone agrees, on the one hand, once again, that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet. But if you look at Second Temple Jewish research, you'll know that John Collins and others have been very...
Jim Vanderkamp.
Jim Vanderkamp. Oh my gosh,
we know
we
can thank him, so we can appropriately thank him.
Absolutely. Jim Vanderkamp was absolutely phenomenal and pivotal in helping me see, no, you read the book of Enoch, you read the book of Jubilees, you read other sources from the pseudepigrapha. Apocalypses don't just tell you what's going to happen at the end. You have tours of heavenly realm and the unveiling of heavenly secrets. So what I was trying to argue here is everyone on the one hand agrees Jesus was an apocalyptic Jewish prophet, but he would be a very odd apocalyptic prophet if he never revealed any heavenly mysteries, right? And so what I tried to show in this chapter is if you look at the healing of the paralytic, the question of John the Baptist, and then the most important one, I think, in some ways, is what I call the apocalyptic thunderbolt in Matthew 11. No one knows the Father except the Son, and no one knows the Son except no one knows who the Son is except for the Father, and those to whom the Son chooses to apocalypto, to reveal his identity. So you actually have Jesus in the Greek Gospels using the term apocalypto, the verb, unveiling, but that passage almost universally gets ignored. So what I was trying to do here is say, if you look at some of these passages, Jesus is revealing the apocalyptic secret, not just of the coming of the kingdom at the end of time or the end of the age, that's important, but the apocalyptic secret of his heavenly identity, right? So the first example that's really important is the famous story of the healing of the paralytic, where Jesus uses the expression Son of Man to refer to himself. We can't go into that in a lot of detail. Here, I would just want to emphasize that in context, when Jesus says to the paralytic, "My son, your sins are forgiven," which is a very weird thing for an adult male to say to another adult male, but I'll leave that aside. "My son, your sins are forgiven." And they challenge him, "Who can forgive sins alone? This man blasphemes." His response is, "So that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, I say, rise, take up your pallet and walk." So what I argue there is that the apocalyptic mystery he's revealing there is he's implicitly identifying himself with the heavenly Son of Man from Daniel chapter 7. Again, in the context of the charge of blasphemy and a question about his identity, which when you take that whole context into account, there's an implicit claim here, not just to be a messianic figure, but to be the heavenly Son of Man that Daniel sees in Daniel chapter 7, who Jesus is claiming also has authority to forgive sins, which is a divine authority, on earth, right? Now, some people say, oh, well, the priest could forgive sins in the temple. But again, the crowd's response, they don't say, who can forgive sins but the priests alone? They say, who can forgive sins but God alone? And in fact, in Mark, it's really important. It's who can forgive sins, hesotheos, but the one God. So I think that chapter, a passage, Mark chapter 2, the healing paralytic, is absolutely foundational for showing that what we have here is an apocalyptic episode in which Jesus is lifting the veil of his identity as the heavenly Son of Man and his divine authority to forgive sins. But again, it is apocalyptic. So in other words, Adela Collins says this, using the expression the Son of Man both reveals his heavenly identity and conceals it at the same time. And this is one of the cool things about apocalyptic language and literature. There's a revelatory aspect, but there's also an element that remains veiled, right? You pull back the veil somewhat, but there's still, these are mysterious images, mysterious language. It's meant to, in a sense, divide his audience into those who have ears to hear and then those who can't, right? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the last one, the Apocalyptic Thunderbolt, this was the passage that led me to write this book, actually, because I'd actually done an article on this passage for a Festschrift for John Meyer. And what I found, Matt, was fascinating. Again, everyone agrees Jesus is an apocalyptic prophet, but the one passage in the Synoptics where you have explicit language of apocalypsis, gets either ignored or rejected in many works on the historical Jesus for this reason, because it's too Johannine to be authentic. Yeah. Right, yeah, because you have Jesus here using the absolute language of no one knows the Son except the Father, no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. And Gates of Ramesh and others say, well, this is too Johannine to be authentic. And that really was frustrating to me, because that's the height of anachronism, to say that a passage that only occurs in the Synoptics can't be considered potentially historical because it's too Johannine. No, it's synoptic. It's not in John. You can't take that category and then impose it on this and then use it to inauthenticate it. So what I tried to argue here is that in this famous passage, which I forget which German scholar it was who called it the Johannine Thunderbolt for that reason, I call it the Apocalyptic Thunderbolt. What I try to show here is that this is exhibit A for the apocalyptic Jesus, because the secret he's revealing in this passage is not just the secret of the kingdom of God or even of his messianic identity. It is of a sonship. It's the secret of his sonship. Michael Papard says this. It's the sonship secret. And what he's describing here is a sonship that is so transcendent and so unique that the only person who knows it is the heavenly omnipotent Father, right? So it's greater than creaturely sonship, of all the created beings, or the covenantal sonship of Israel. Anyone can know that. Even messianic sonship, the Davidic sonship, that can be known. And the angelic, and the angels are called sons of gods. All those kinds of sonship can be known. But apparently there's this one sonship this mysterious apocalyptic sonship, which only the Father knows. And so I think that apocalyptic sonship, that apocalyptic secret, is the heavenly or divine sonship that Jesus is coming to reveal as an apocalyptic prophet.
Wow, that's fantastic, Brant. We are running a little shy on time, and I would love to talk with you more about your 5th chapter on blasphemy, but we're going to have to pass that by. But as we kind of wrap up, I want to say that reading your book on the historical Jesus was probably the most worshipful book I've read on the historical Jesus, with maybe the exception, or at least to add alongside it, N.T. Wright's masterpiece, Jesus and the Victory of God. That was a very worshipful book for me too. And I think readers, as they read this, will be drawn into worship because you're talking about Jesus, the historical Jesus, and his divinity. It draws you into worship. So I was curious, was there a part in writing this book that you found most worshipful, that you were like, you kind of felt your own heart lifted up to God and exalted as you were writing this book?
Oh, wow, that's a great question.
I mean, the whole thing could have been a worshipful experience, but...
Sure. No, this book was very close to my heart, Matt. Obviously, as a Christian, as a Catholic, I believe in the divinity of Jesus of Nazareth. But it's a different thing to ask that question as a historian and say, well, where does the evidence lead me? How far does it go? What are the reasons for that faith? Is that faith a reasonable faith? So I think, honestly, for me, the chapter that was the most worshipful, as you put it, was actually that was on the thunderbolt. That is such a mysterious passage.
It is.
And the idea that no one knows the Son except the Father, and yet that the Son comes into the world precisely to unveil, to apocalypsis, that unveil that mystery of his identity, of his unique sonship. And then, of course, as we'll see with Paul in Galatians, and that apocalypsis is going to be the foundation of the mystery of the church, is that God he wants to come and draw all human beings into that mystery and make us sons in the Son, to draw us into the life of the Trinity, as you've shown so good in your work. That is something that really does drive you to your knees and to prayer and to worship, because it is a beautiful, glorious, and transcendent mystery, and it's good news. That's the good news. It's the gospel. So I do hope that this book, although it does restrict itself to reason, I try to limit it to reason. I hope it has implications for faith that believers will find edifying, and that non-believers may find even challenging, and have to ask the question again. Well, wait. Who did Jesus of Nazareth claim to be? And are those claims, are they true, right? Is there a reason to believe that those were in fact the case? And that his claims, divine self claims, weren't just a historical fact, but that there is a divine truth, an apocalyptic truth even, waiting to be revealed.
Thanks so much, Brant. And I assure listeners that whether you're a non-believer or a believer, you will find plenty of grist for the mill, as this book is extraordinarily well argued on a historical level, but it does also, I think, at the end, drive you to your knees in worship. So it's really a fantastic book.
Thanks.
You've been listening to On Script, hosted today by Matthew Bates. My guest has been Brant Pitre, author of Jesus and Divine Christology, published by Erdman's in 2024. A link for purchasing is on our webpage, www.onscript.study. Until next time.
You've been listening to On Script, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.